Good morning, everyone. My name is Guy Golan, and I'm a professor at Texas Christian University. Oh, it's right there. Today, I want to talk to you about international public relations. Is there such a thing as international public relations as opposed to domestic public relations? The answer probably is no. If your client is a Fortune 500 or any publicly traded company in the world, you are going to deal with a variety of stakeholders, many of which are not going to be in your host nation, right? So think about what we do in public relations. We're essentially building and maintaining mutually beneficial relationships. Well, if you're managing PR for Coke, Pepsi, Tesla, Apple, whichever, Lululemon, whichever brand you like, you're going to deal with a variety of stakeholders that have to do with the organizational supply chain. So let's think about what are some really important things to think about when it comes to public relations in the international aspect of it. First thing is what I just mentioned, the supply chain. Understanding your client's supply chain is going to be pivotal to managing relationships. Take, for example, something as simple as a pair of Nike shoes. Nike shoes are manufactured primarily in Southeast Asia. These shoes have to be manufactured over there. They come on large boats all the way to the West Coast ports in Long Beach and Los Angeles. From there, they have to make it to the many suppliers all across the nation, all the way to the store shelves, and all the way to your home via Amazon or online social commerce. Well, think about how many stakeholders are involved in the supply chain. We're talking about foreign governments, we're talking about foreign labor, we're talking about trade unions, we're speaking about suppliers, we're speaking about transportation, we're speaking about workers here in the United States, and all the different elements in your supply chain where if any of those relationships are undermined, that can affect the overall success or failure of the organization that you work for. So what are some really, really important things to think about? The first one is geopolitics. Many public relations students don't really think about geopolitics as a part of our jobs, but think about how governments all around the world can interrupt your brand or your organization's relationship with its key stakeholders, right? Whether it's its own consumers here at home, investor relations, maybe donors, maybe it's reputation management, right? So governments can really play an important role. I'll give you an example. Very recently, in 2021, the Chinese government cracked down on a lot of technology companies. So Tesla, which really cares about the Chinese market, really had to play a fine role between how it addressed the Chinese government and how it addressed its own stock investors here in the United States and its own customers here in the United States. On one hand, Tesla and Elon Musk had to be very polite and very careful in what they had to say to the Chinese government. They didn't want a crackdown like other Western companies faced, or Chinese government companies for that part. And on the other hand, they had to answer the needs and wants, the ESG concerns of people here in the United States who are cared about such things as privacy, currency manipulation, and human rights, right? So it's a very fine line you have to talk about when you talk about geopolitics, right? So anything from human rights around the world, supply chains around the world, tariffs, how labor issues in other countries are going to impact your company here and abroad, and so forth. So as a public relation practitioner, you have to be an expert and you have to be aware of geopolitics and how they may affect relationships of your brand or your organization. Second thing you have to think about is the very important role of culture in international PR. A lot of people always, there's an argument about standardization versus localization. Do we take the same message, the same brand narrative, the same relationship strategy that works in the United States and apply it in Europe, in Africa, South America, in Asia, and so forth? And there are a lot of pros and cons to each one. But we learn all along the way that what works in one country may not work in another. And I'm not just talking about such things as Dunkin' Donuts going to India and creating more savory donuts for breakfast. I'm not just talking about McDonald's going to the same Indian market and creating vegetarian options for the local cuisine. And I'm not talking about McDonald's going to Israel and creating kosher menu items, right? We're talking about something much bigger. We're talking about understanding how consumers' expectations of brands and organizations are different all across the world. So a lot of market research is necessary to understand your local stakeholders and what may impact the relationships they have with. One fantastic tool that I like to teach my students about is Hofstede's 6 cultural dimensions. So Geert Hofstede was an anthropologist, I believe, sociologist, anthropologist, one of those. And he argued that every country around the world falls into 6 different dimensions in different ways. So for the first one is power distance. How does a society deal with the lack of equality within its society, right? So for Hofstede, nations such as Korea, where students bow to their professor when they see them, how many of you bowed to your University of Alabama professors this morning? We don't do that, right? Because the United States has a very low power distance, but in Korea and Japan, they're very high power distance societies, right? It's a society where hierarchy does play a role and it's okay. In American society, not so much, right? Another cultural dimension is individualism, whether a nation is collective or individualistic. So again, the United States is a very individualistic society, whereas other countries around the world are more collective in the question of how do I define myself as an individual, right? And how much does my group belonging, right, identifies who I am. So the United States, again, considered very individualistic, and nations such as, let's say, Korea, again, very collective, right? Then feminine and masculine societies that are more nurturing. So think about Nordic nations like Sweden, Norway, Denmark, a lot of support for the poor and the weak, whereas nations are more masculine. Nations like the United States, where power is considered more important than nurture. The next one is uncertainty avoidance. Countries where in their culture, ambiguity is a terrible thing or a good thing. Think about yourselves. After you graduate, do you know where you're going to live? You may get a job in New York City or LA or Miami, or you may stay put in Alabama. That's cool. Well, a lot of societies are really fear averse and change averse, right? They do not embrace uncertainty, whereas the United States is more open to change. 2 more, long-term versus short-term orientation. Think about nations like Egypt, been around for thousands of years. They have a very long-term perspective on life, same as many Asian cultures. Whereas a lot of nations are very short-term oriented, where goals are put first before anything else. Again, the United States falls into one of those. And the last one is restraint versus indulgence. Cultures that embrace happiness and indulgence, such as the United States and many Western European nations, and as opposed to other nations where pursuit of happiness is not considered a positive thing, and restraint is much more appreciated, right? So again, Hofstede's cultural dimensions really allow public relations practitioners to do a lot of research about the nations where their key stakeholders are, and by understanding the local culture, they can manage relationships much better. So again, what do you need to think about if you're going to do international PR? Remember that there is no such thing as domestic PR, really, unless you're only managing your local taco shop's public relation efforts or a local NGO. But most large organizations are a part of the global supply chain, and they manage many stakeholders all across the world. You need to be aware of geopolitics. You need to be aware of the advantages and disadvantages of standardization versus localization. You need to understand how culture plays a role in the relationship management function, and you have to identify the key actors that may shape or hurt or help your relationship management success. Well, that was a very, very, very quick lesson on international public relations. If you have any more questions, hit me up on my Twitter. And thanks again for the opportunity to speak to you today. Have a great day.